Dust hangs thick and gold under a white-hot sky. A young woman is dragged into the middle of a packed dirt street, her arm locked hard enough to bruise, while the whole town stands frozen on porches and in doorways. Her good dress tears open at the shoulder. No one moves. A horse approaches unhurried. A stranger swings down. His eyes take in the grip, the watching faces, the badge that does nothing. Let go of her. Fingers dig deeper instead of releasing. The air itself seems to hold its breath. Something is about to break. He steps closer. Before any of it happened. Before the street. Before the torn sleeve. Before a stranger's voice cut through a town that had forgotten how to speak up for itself. There was just a Tuesday morning, and a girl at a kitchen table, and a column of numbers that wouldn't add up right no matter how many times she ran them. Odessa Kane had been keeping her father's books since she was 14 years old. 5 years now. Long enough that the figures had stopped feeling like arithmetic and started feeling like a language. One she understood better than most people in Salt Fork understood plain English, which was why the number sat wrong in her chest that morning. $1,100. Written in Wyatt Voss's own hand on paper, her father had signed 3 weeks back with fingers that shook the whole time he held the pen. She'd checked the bank's own copy against her father's twice already. Twice, and the number hadn't changed either time, and something about that kept nagging at her in a way she couldn't yet name, because numbers didn't lie. People lied. Numbers just sat there, patient, waiting for somebody honest enough to read them right. She didn't know yet how right she was about to be. Didn't know a scrap of what the next 4 days would ask of her. She just knew the number was wrong, and she intended to find out why. And that intention alone was more spine than most of Salt Fork had shown in longer than she cared to count. Then her father had come to the doorway, hat already in his hands. And she'd known, the way a body knows weather before the sky commits to it, that whatever came next wasn't going to wait for her ledgers to catch up. They walked into town together, her father a half step ahead the whole way, like a man leading a procession he'd rather not be leading. The road ran flat and pale under a sky gone white with heat, and Odessa counted her own steps out of habit, the way she counted everything, 'cause counting gave her hands something to do that wasn't reaching for a father who wouldn't meet her eyes. Old Mrs. Abernathy was out front of her little house past the schoolhouse, beating a rug over the porch rail, and she paused when she saw them coming, rug forgotten mid-strike. Amos Kane. Her voice carried plenty far enough. "Where are you two-headed, dressed like that on a Tuesday?" Amos didn't answer, didn't even slow. Mrs. Abernathy's eyes found Odessa's instead, and something passed across the old woman's face, not pity. Exactly. Odessa had grown skilled at telling the difference. Pity made her want to spit. This was something closer to worry, honest and unadorned, and Odessa found she could bear that better. "You take care, child," Mrs. Abernathy called after them. "I intend to," Odessa called back, though her voice came out steadier than she felt. Further on, past the schoolhouse, 2 of the Hollis boys were driving a wagon of feed toward the mercantile, and one of them, the younger one, Odessa forgot his given name but remembered he'd once brought her a jar of his mother's plum preserves the winter her own mother died, tipped his hat to her, quick and awkward, the way boys did when they didn't quite know what a gesture was supposed to mean, but offered it anyway. She held on to that small kindness the rest of the walk, folded it up small, and tucked it away somewhere she could find it again later. Because she had a feeling, deep and wordless, that she was going to need every scrap of kindness this town had left to offer before the day finished with her. Not everyone offered it so freely. Old Pruitt, who ran the feed store, watched them pass from his doorway with his arms crossed and his mouth set in a thin, satisfied line, the particular expression of a man who enjoyed watching other people's misfortune arrive right on schedule. He'd owed Garrison Voss money once too. Odessa knew, years back, and had paid it off early enough to avoid whatever fate the Kanes were currently walking toward. There was a kind of relief in some people's faces when trouble landed on somebody else's family instead of their own. Odessa had learned not to expect otherwise. It didn't make the sting of it any smaller, seeing it plain on a neighbor's face in broad daylight. "Don't look at him," Amos said, low, not breaking stride. "I wasn't going to, you were about to. Maybe I was." She kept walking. "Doesn't mean I would have." They reached Main Street. Just as Wyatt Voss came around from the direction of the bank, 2 of his father's hired men, trailing a half step behind him, like they weren't quite sure of their own role in whatever was about to happen, and Odessa felt her father's hand find her wrist before she'd even fully registered the reason why. "Amos, Wyatt's voice, trying for authority and landing somewhere closer to apology. My father sent me to fetch her proper. Wants this settled before noon. Settled. Amos's voice had gone thin. That's a fine word for it. It's the word we've got, Wyatt said, and something in his own face suggested he didn't much care for it either, though he hadn't yet found the nerve to say so out loud. That was when the walking stopped being a walk and became something else entirely, a hand on her arm, harder than Wyatt likely intended, and the whole slow procession toward the middle of Main Street, where the rest of the town had already begun gathering, drawn by whatever invisible signal passes through a small place when everyone senses a story about to happen that they'll be telling their grandchildren about, one way or another, for years to come. The dust came up gold that afternoon, thick, slow, hanging in the light like it had nowhere better to be. Salt Fork wasn't much of a town. One street, packed dirt. A mercantile with a crooked sign. A bank with paint too fresh for a place this poor, and a crowd. 60, maybe 70 people, standing on porches and in doorways, watching. Not moving. Not one of them moving. Because that's what people do when they're scared. They watch. Odessa Kane stood in the middle of that street with a hand clamped around her arm hard enough to bruise Wyatt Voss's hand. And it wasn't gentle. It wasn't meant to be. Her father stood on her other side. Amos Kane. 51 years old and looking every year of it, plus 10 more, his own hand wrapped around her other wrist like he was the one drowning. Not looking at her. Looking at the boardwalk. At his own boots. Anywhere but his daughter's face. Odessa didn't look at him either. She'd stopped expecting him to look up 3 weeks ago. Her sleeve had torn at the shoulder. She could feel the air on her skin where the seam had split. And she thought, distant and strange, the way you think odd things when the real thing is too big to hold, she thought, that was my good dress. That was the dress I wore to Mama's grave. And now it's torn in the street in front of God and everybody. And nobody's going to help me sew it, because nobody in this town sews anything that Garrison Voss doesn't want sewn shut. Stop it, Odessa. Stop thinking like that. Except she couldn't stop. Because that's what a mind does when a body can't run. It runs anyway. Just inside, just where nobody can see it, flailing. She caught sight of her own reflection in the bank's front window as Wyatt dragged her past it. A big girl in a torn blue dress. That's what the glass showed back at her. And for one wild, ungoverned second, the thought that came wasn't fear at all. It was something meaner. Something that sounded like every whisper she'd swallowed her whole life without answering back. Look at her. No wonder her father had to buy her a husband. Which, no. Stop that. That wasn't true, and she knew it wasn't true, had known it wasn't true since she was 11 years old, and decided her own worth wasn't something the county got to vote on. But knowing a thing and feeling a thing weren't the same animal. Not on a day like this one. Not with the whole street watching, and nobody stepping forward. You're hurting her, Amos said. Quiet. Too quiet to be a real objection. More like a man testing whether the floor would hold his weight before he stepped on it. Wyatt Voss didn't loosen his grip. This is between families, Amos. You signed the papers. I signed papers for a loan. Not for this. Same thing now. Wyatt's voice cracked in the middle of that sentence. Yep, just a hair. Just enough that Odessa heard it and filed it away. The way she filed every column of every number her whole short life. He's 26 years old and he sounds like a boy reciting lines he didn't write. She almost felt sorry for him, almost. Then his fingers dug in tighter and the almost went away. The sheriff stood off to the side, Tom Loomis. Thumbs hooked in his belt. Star catching the light and doing exactly nothing else useful. Watching, same as everybody else. Because watching costs nothing. And doing something might cost you your own roof over your head. And in Salt Fork, Garrison Voss owned most of the roofs. Loomis wasn't proud of the watching. That much showed plain on his face if a person looked close enough, which nobody bothered to that afternoon. He'd worn the badge 4 years now. 4 years of telling himself the next fight would be the one worth the risk. 4 years of the next fight never quite arriving. A man could build a whole life out of next times. He'd learned, and wake up one morning having built nothing at all. That's when the horse came around by the feed barn. Not fast. Not slow either, just unhurried. The way a rider moves when trouble is somebody else's schedule, not his. Odessa saw him before anyone said a word. A man. 33, if she'd had to guess it. Though the sun had put a decade's worth of extra weather into his face, the way this country did to men who spent more nights under open sky than under any roof. Dust-colored duster coat, worn soft at the shoulders, like it had crossed more states than she'd ever see the inside of a map for. A hat pulled low. And under it, Eyes that moved once, slow, across the whole scene, the torn sleeve, the grip on her arm, the sheriff's useless thumbs, and didn't move again after that. Because he'd already seen everything he needed to see. He let the horse stop itself. Nobody in that street breathed the same after that. "Let go of her," he said, not loud. Didn't need to be. Wyatt's hand tightened instead of loosening. A reflex, not a decision. And something crossed his face right after, quick, gone fast, that looked a whole lot like regret. "This isn't your business, mister." Wyatt's chin came up, trying for steel, landing somewhere closer to tin. "This is a family matter. Family doesn't drag family through a street by the arm." The stranger swung down off the horse, slow, deliberate, giving every man on that porch time to see his hands were empty and see that they didn't need to be anything else. "I'll ask once more." He stepped closer. "On account of I like to be fair about these things." "Or what?" "Let go of her." Silence. The kind that has weight to it. The kind you could set a coin on and hear it land. Odessa looked at him, not at Wyatt, not at her father, still staring at his own boots, like the answer to all of this was written somewhere in the dirt between them. She looked at the stranger, and something moved through her that wasn't quite hope. Hope felt too soft for what this was. It was closer to recognition. The way you recognize a storm coming before the first drop falls. Something in the air changes. Something in your skin knows before your mind catches up. Sheriff Loomis finally found his legs and took 2 steps forward. "Mister, I don't know you, but you'd best understand the Voss family carries considerable weight around here. I understand a woman's being taken somewhere against her wanting to go." The stranger's voice hadn't shifted pitch once since he arrived. Not once. And a man wearing a badge is standing here watching it happen. That landed harder than a shout would have. Because shouting men can be waited out. Matched. Argued down eventually. Worn thin like everything else in this drought-choked country. But a man who spoke like this, even unbothered, already finished deciding that was a different animal altogether, and every soul on that street felt it settle into their chest like cold water. Wyatt's grip on Odessa's arm had gone slack. He didn't seem to notice it happening. "She's promised to me," he said, voice cracking again. Worse this time. "Her father signed the papers, $1,100 against the cane place, due this month, and my father's willing to forgive the whole note if she marries me. That's not a wedding, son." The stranger hadn't reached for the revolver on his hip. Hadn't needed to. "That's a debt collection wearing a church dress." Somebody on the mercantile porch laughed. Short, ugly. Cut off fast when 3 or 4 heads turned toward the sound like it might catch fire and spread. And then Odessa spoke. First time, her voice came out steadier than the torn sleeve or the white-knuckled hand had any right to allow. "Let go of me, Wyatt." A breath. "You heard him." Wyatt let go. What happened after took less time than it takes to say it happened. Amos's hand came off his daughter's wrist like it had caught flame. His shoulders dropped. And for one raw second the whole street watched a father's shame crack open in front of them, as a brand on a steer's hip. The sheriff's thumbs came out of his belt. Went nowhere useful. And the stranger, who still hadn't given a single soul on that street his name, looked at Odessa Kane, touched 2 fingers to the brim of his hat. An old habit. From a life he wasn't going to explain. Not today. "Touch her again," he said. To Wyatt. To the street in general. To the Voss name hanging over the whole county. Like a storm that hadn't broken yet, and it'll be the last thing your hand ever does. He didn't stay to enjoy the quiet. He led his horse to the trough outside the livery and let her drink while the town found its voice again behind him. Low murmurs, rising like steam off wet ground. And he listened to none of it, because he already knew what they'd say. He'd heard versions of it in a dozen towns before this one. "Who is he? What's he want? Somebody go get Garrison." Odessa watched him walk away and felt something in her chest do a strange, unfamiliar thing. Loosen. Just a little. Just enough to notice the absence of a weight that had been sitting there so long she'd forgotten it was a weight at all. Then she remembered her torn sleeve, and her father's shame, and the $1,100 that still technically hung over her family's roof like a blade nobody had cut down yet. The stranger's kindness, if that's even what this was, hadn't paid a single dime of it. Amos found her sitting on the porch step 20 minutes later, hat in his hands, turning it over and over, the way a man does when his hands need something to do that isn't reaching for his own daughter's forgiveness. Odessa. She didn't look up. "Don't. I need to explain." "I know the explanation, Papa. I've known it for 3 weeks. Her voice was flat, controlled. The way she kept the ledgers controlled, because controlled was the only thing left she got to decide. You owe Garrison Voss $1,100. You can't pay it. He offered a way out that isn't really a way out, and you were too tired, too scared, too something to tell him no. It's not that simple. Then tell me what's simple about it. He didn't answer, because there wasn't an answer that made it simple. There never had been. 2 years of drought had done what drought does. Thinned the herds. Thinned the water in Cottonwood Creek down to a trickle that belonged, in practice if not on paper, to whoever held the most debt against whoever's land sat next to it. That was Garrison Voss's doing. Mostly. Everybody in Salt Fork knew it. Nobody said it where the wrong ears might carry it home to him. Odessa had done the books herself since she was 14. She knew every column, every figure, every dollar that came in against every dollar that went out. And 3 weeks ago, when her father sat her down at the kitchen table and told her what Garrison Voss had proposed, she'd felt the floor of her own life tilt sideways and never quite come back level. I asked him with my eyes, she said now, quiet, since nobody in this town gave me leave to use my mouth. Amos's hand stilled on the hat brim. What? That man out there. I didn't call for him, I didn't wave him down. She finally looked up and her eyes were dry, which somehow made it worse than if she'd been crying. But I looked at him like I needed somebody to hear me. And he heard me. First person in this whole town who has, in 3 weeks. Her father's face crumpled, just slightly, and he looked away toward the mountains going purple with the coming evening. I didn't ask him to interfere, she added. But I'm not sorry he did. Amos sat down beside her on the step. Slow, careful, like a man testing whether the wood would hold 2 kinds of weight at once, his own and whatever was left of his pride. Your mother used to say I worried too much about what other men thought of me, he said, after a while. Said it was going to cost us something someday. Guess she saw further down the road than I ever managed to. She usually did. I keep thinking, if she were here, she'd have known what to do about Garrison 3 weeks ago. Wouldn't have let it get this far. Maybe. Odessa's voice softened, just slightly. Or maybe she'd have been just as scared as you were, and just as stuck. And the only difference is, I wouldn't have found out about it in the middle of the street in front of the whole county. Amos didn't have an answer for that. He just sat there beside her, hat in his hands, and let the silence be honest between them for the first time in 3 weeks. The stranger hadn't given his name yet. Not to the girl, not to her father, not to a single soul in Salt Fork. He preferred it that way, for now. Names had a way of following a man into places he didn't always want followed, and this one had been carrying his Rance Colby through 3 states and more towns than he cared to number, most of them a good deal less trouble than this one already promised to be. He unsaddled his horse at the livery, paid for a stall out of coin that was getting thinner by the week, and sat that night on an overturned crate in the open doorway, rifle across his knees, watching the road. Because he'd meant every word he said in that street. And men like Garrison Voss always sent somebody to test whether a stranger's words were the kind that held weight or the kind that blew off by morning like everything else in this dust-choked country. He didn't sleep, which was fine. He hadn't slept well in longer than he cared to count anyway. He'd learned over the years to read a night the way other men read a face. The particular hush before trouble differed from the ordinary hush of a place simply asleep thinner. Somehow, like the air itself knew to hold its breath. Salt Fork's ordinary hush had a comfortable weight to it, cattle lowing somewhere distant, a dog barking twice and giving up, the creak of a windmill, turning slow, in whatever breath of wind still bothered to visit this drought-starved country after dark. He listened for the moment that hush changed texture, and until it did, he simply watched the road and let his mind wander where it wanted, because a mind kept on too short, a leash tended to wear itself out faster than the watching did. Tonight it wandered to a town called Willow Bend, 3 years back now, where he'd ridden in 2 days after word reached him that his sister needed help. 2 days too slow, that time, though not as slow as the 4 days that came after, the 4 days that mattered, the 4 days he still hadn't forgiven himself for. Regardless of how many times logic reminded him a man couldn't outrun a letter that took a week to find him in the first place. He'd stood in a different street that time, a different family's porch. And nobody had stopped their horse for his sister the way he'd stopped his for a stranger's daughter this afternoon, because there hadn't been anybody left in Willow Bend willing to risk what standing up cost. That was the thing nobody warned a man about, riding into towns like this one. Not the danger. The danger was simple enough, plain arithmetic, bullets and distances and how fast a man's hand moved. What nobody warned him about was the weight of watching the same story happen twice, in 2 different towns 3 years apart, and understanding all over again exactly how much it cost a place when its people decided watching was safer than doing. Salt Fork hadn't decided that yet. Not entirely. He'd seen it in the girl's eyes before he ever climbed down off his horse, something that hadn't yet given up, banked low like coals under ash, waiting on somebody, anybody, to blow on it enough to catch again. He intended to be that somebody, if it came to it, had already decided as much 3 days out from Salt Fork before he ever knew the town's name, though he hadn't fully understood the decision himself until he saw her face in that street. 3 years, if he was being honest with himself, which he tried not to be most nights because honesty like that had teeth. His sister's face came to him sometimes in the dark between one breath and the next. Younger than him by 6 years. There'd been a man back east who held paper on the family, same as Voss held it on the Caneys now, and Rance had been 2 states off collecting a bounty when that man came to collect his own way. 4 days. He'd gotten home 4 days too late to matter. 4 days was a number he'd had a great ideal of with since it didn't get lighter with the sitting, just familiar. The way a stone in a boot gets familiar. You still feel every step. You just stop expecting it to go away. He'd worn a ranger's badge for 2 years after that. Told himself the badge would fix something. It hadn't. Badges didn't reach backward in time no matter how a man polished them. So he'd taken it off, folded it into the bottom of a saddlebag he still hadn't quite found the nerve to empty, and started riding for fees instead. Bounty work, cleaner in its way. A man could tell himself the debts he collected on were honest ones at least, except honest debts didn't always stay honest. He was learning that plain enough 4 days into whatever Salt Fork was about to become. So when he'd ridden into town that afternoon, passing through on other business entirely, a man he'd been tracking for a fee, name didn't matter yet, and seen a girl held in the street by the arm while a whole town watched and did nothing. He hadn't thought about it, not really. His body had simply stopped the horse before his mind finished catching up to why. Because some things you don't leave behind once you've seen them left. Garrison Voss's house sat 2 miles north of town, on the only rise of ground worth calling a hill in that whole flat country. From the porch, a man could see clear to the horizon in every direction, which was, Garrison liked to say, the entire point of building there. He was reading a detailed of the afternoon's failure by lamplight, when Wyatt came in from the yard, still carrying the smell of horse and cold evening air. You could have warned me he'd make a fool of me in front of the whole street. I could have. Garrison didn't look up from his ledger. Wouldn't have changed a thing you did about it. I don't want it done this way, Pa. Wyatt dropped into the chair across from the desk. The ledger sat open between them, a page of figures that had been keeping him up nights for 3 weeks running. Marrying a girl who looks at me like something scraped off a boot heel, he said. Sending men to burn fence posts to scare an old man into signing his daughter over. This isn't ranching anymore. This isn't even business. It's exactly business. Garrison closed the ledger with 2 fingers, unhurried, the way a man closes something when he's used to having the last word in every room he's ever occupied. Amos Kane holds the last water rights on Cottonwood Creek that I don't already own. Without them, this herd loses 200 head a season come August when the creek runs dry for good. You could offer him cash for the rights. I did. He wouldn't sell. Sentimental old fool would rather watch his herd starve than let go of dirt his wife's buried under. Garrison leaned back, so I offered a decent way out of his debt instead. Some men would call that generous. Some men would call it robbery, wearing a wedding ring instead of a gun. Garrison looked at his son a long moment. Something almost like respect crossed his face. Then it hardened back into its usual shape, the way it always did. You'll thank me in 10 years, he said. When this ranch is the biggest thing in the county and you're not standing behind some fence line, wondering if this is the year the creek finally dries for good. That's what I built this for. Never was for me. Wyatt didn't answer that. He'd heard the speech before. Different words, different going back as far as he could remember his father, owning anything at all. He walked out onto the porch instead, stood a long while looking south toward town, toward a girl he'd known his whole life and never once, not one single time, asked what she wanted. Behind him, through the study window, he could hear his father already dictating a letter to be carried into town come morning. Something about a marshal. Something about a reputation that needed sorting out before it became inconvenient. Wyatt didn't ask what his father meant by it. He had a feeling he'd find out soon enough, and he had a worse feeling he wasn't going to like the shape of it. The stranger's name spread through Salt Fork by the next morning the way names do in small towns. Fast and wrong in at least 3 details by the time it reached the 3rd porch. Rance Colby. Bounty man, somebody said. Ranger. Once, said somebody else, though nobody could say for certain which was true, and which was just a story growing legs overnight. Odessa heard both versions before breakfast, and believed neither fully and both partly, which felt about right for a town that hadn't had anything interesting happen in it since the drought started eating the county alive. She brought coffee out to the corral fence, told herself it was manners. Told herself that twice. Actually, on the walk out, because once didn't quite convince her either time. He was currying his horse's coat in long, even strokes when she got there. Didn't stop when she approached, didn't look up right away. She held the tin cup out until he took it. She's a good animal, Odessa said. First thing either of them had said since the coffee changed hands. She is, you raise her? Found her half-starved on a trail 2 winters back. Nobody claiming her. He kept brushing, steady, unhurried. Some things you don't leave behind once you've seen them left. Odessa's eyes came up to his face at that, quick, like she'd caught something in the words he hadn't quite meant to say out loud. He let the silence sit rather than explain it further. For a while there was only the sound of brush against hide, and the evening birds settling into what few cottonwoods still had leaves worth settling into, and the particular stillness of a hot day letting go of its heat all at once, the way it does in that flat country when the sun finally quits. You had someone, Odessa said. Not a question. She'd noticed she did that, said things like statements when everybody else in her life dressed the same thoughts up as questions, soft and hedged and easy to walk back from. She didn't walk things back. Not anymore. Rance kept brushing. A sister, he said finally. Younger than me by 6 years. He didn't say more than that. She didn't ask him to. She only nodded once, slow, like a woman filing away a number in a ledger she intended to remember. Then you understand, she said, why I won't let this county decide what happens to me twice. Twice? My mother died the year the first drought hit. I was 11. I watched my father sign away half our herd to keep the rest of us fed, and I told myself back then I'd never stand still for that kind of taking again. She turned the empty cup over in her hands. I went through his papers 2 nights back, and there's a bank ledger entry from 3 years past, in Garrison's own clerk's hand. Shows our debt at $400. She looked at him steady. The note Wyatt waved in the street said $1,100. Rance stopped brushing. Somebody added $700 to that number since, Odessa said. And I intend to find out exactly which of Garrison Voss's clerks did the adding. He studied her for a long moment, something behind his eyes old, careful, doing arithmetic of its own. That's a dangerous thing to go looking for, he said. I know, Voss won't take kindly to being caught. I know that too. She set the cup down on the fence rail, careful, precise, the way she did everything. But I've spent my whole life being told what a girl my size is supposed to want, supposed to settle for. And I am done, Mr. Colby. I am entirely done settling. He almost smiled at that. Almost. Rance, he said. Just Rance, Odessa. I know. You asked my father my name before you asked me. Seemed the polite order of things at the time. A pause. Might have gotten that wrong. You did. But there was something warmer under it now. Something that hadn't been in her voice since before the street, before the torn sleeve, before 3 weeks of watching her father fail to meet her eyes over supper. I'll work on it, Rance said. See that you do. This coffee's terrible. By the way, Rance said, after a long pull from the tin cup, deadpan enough that it took her a second to realize he meant it as something other than an insult. Excuse me? Terrible coffee. Weakest thing I've had west of the Mississippi, and I've drunk creek water that argued a stronger case for itself. He took another sip anyway. Just thought you ought to know in case nobody's told you. Nobody's told me because nobody else has had the nerve to complain about my coffee to my face, Mr. Colby. Guess I'm not most people then. Guess you're not. Despite herself, despite the whole impossible weight of the day sitting on her chest, something tugged at the corner of her mouth, unfamiliar and stubborn, refusing to be talked back down. I'll have you know that terrible coffee saved your life once already today. How do you figure that? If I hadn't brought it out here, you'd still be standing in this corral alone, brushing that horse in silence, missing out on the extraordinary company currently standing in front of you. She lifted her chin, mock serious. A man could die of loneliness out here. I've heard stories. Is that so? It is. Terrible way to go, apparently. Very slow. Well, Rance considered the empty cup a long moment, and something in his face had gone soft, in a way it hadn't been since he rode into town. Some of the old weather smoothed out of it, if only briefly. In that case, I suppose I ought to thank you for the coffee after all. terrible as it was. You're welcome. She took the cup back from him, fingers brushing his for half a second longer than the exchange strictly required, and neither one of them commented on it, though both of them noticed. I'll bring a fresh pot tomorrow. See if I can't disappoint you again. Looking forward to it already. The horse, sensing perhaps that the brushing had paused too long in service of conversation that didn't concern her, nudged Rance hard enough in the shoulder to nearly knock the empty cup from his hand, and Odessa laughed a real laugh. Startled out of her, the first one Salt Fork had heard out of her in longer than either of them could have guessed. She's jealous, Odessa said. She's spoiled, Rance corrected. There's a difference, though I'll admit the line gets thin some days. Sounds like somebody I know. Careful now. I didn't say who. Odessa's eyes danced, quick and bright, before she caught herself and reeled the moment back in, some old habit of caution reasserting itself even now. I should get back before my father wonders where his good coffee's gotten to. Terrible coffee. That's my terrible coffee, thank you very much. And you'll take what I bring you and be grateful for it. She almost turned to go, then stopped herself, and something in her chest did a strange, quick thing, half courage and half nerves tangled together. For what it's worth, she said, whatever this town's already saying about a girl, my size not being worth the trouble for standing up for. You didn't stop to weigh that particular figure before you got down off your horse. Wasn't weighing anything, Rance said. Just saw a wrong thing happening and figured somebody ought to say so out loud. That's a rare enough thing in this county to be worth remembering. Then remember it, he said. Won't cost you anything to. She left him at the fence with the last of the evening light going soft and gold across the yard and walked back toward the house with something loosened in her chest that hadn't put loose in longer than she cared to count. Either. Garrison Voss didn't wait long. The very next night, past midnight, the way cowardice generally travels, the coyotes went quiet a full hour before anything else did the particular silence animals go when something bigger than themselves is moving through the dark. He'd noticed that quiet before in other places, other watches. Had come to trust it more than any lookout kept with 2 eyes open and both ears half asleep. He heard the horses before he saw them, 4 riders, coming slow across the Canes North pasture instead of the road, which told him plenty about their intentions before a single shot got fired, which is exactly why he was already on his feet by the time the first shot came. That shot took splinters off the corral post 6 feet from where Amos kept his 3 remaining horses. The second one landed closer, close enough that a gelding screamed and threw itself against the rail hard enough to crack the wood. Rance didn't shoot to kill. He put a round through the water barrel closest to the lead rider, close enough that the man felt the spray hit the back of his own neck. And before that rider could wheel his horse around to find the shot, Rance had already put a second round into the dirt directly beneath the second rider's horse, close enough to send the animal up on its hind legs and its rider down into the mud on his backside, cursing loud enough to wake the whole county. It was in that scramble the second rider fighting to keep his seat, his sleeve riding up past the wrist as he grabbed wild for the reins that Rance saw it. A scar, long, jagged, running from wrist to elbow, curved at the end like a fishhook. He filed it away, even as his hands kept working, even as he tracked the third rider's shape through the dark, and put a warning shot close enough to send that horse rearing too. Some part of his mind, the old part, the part that had spent years reading wanted posters by lamplight in a dozen different towns, had already started doing arithmetic. He wouldn't finish until the riders were gone. Next one lands in a man, Rance called down. His voice carried the same unhurried weight it had carried in the street 3 nights back, and that, more than the gunfire, was what sent a real chill down 4 riders' spines all at once. Not the ground around him. Silence, except for the horses, still spooked, still stamping. Tell Garrison his message got here fine, Rance said. Tell him I heard it clear. The 4 riders didn't state it discussed terms. They wheeled and rode hard back the way they'd come, and Rance watched the dust of them settle without lowering the rifle until the sound of hooves had faded past hearing altogether. Amos came out onto the porch in his nightshirt, rifle in hand, shaking badly enough that Rance took the weapon from him gently, before the old man could do himself an injury with it, and Odessa stood in the doorway with a lit lamp, throwing her shadow long across the yard, watching the dust settle where the riders had gone. They'll come back with more, she said. Not a question. Same as everything else, she said. They will. Then why are you smiling? He hadn't realized he was. Wiped it off his face like a man wiping off rain. Because Garrison just told me something true without meaning to, he said. A man who sends riders is to shoot at posts in the dark is a man worried about what happens if this goes to daylight and to law. That's useful to know? That's the most useful thing I've learned since I rode into this town. A pause. There's something else. What? He didn't answer right away. Went instead to the overturned crate by the stable door, sat down slow, and pulled a folded paper from his coat, edges gone soft from handling. Odessa crossed the yard and stood over his shoulder while he unfolded it in the lamplight, a wanted poster. A crude woodcut likeness, a name printed bold beneath it. Cutter Boyle. Wanted for robbery and murder. 2 killings during the Cimarron stagecoach robbery. $11,000 of railroad money never recovered. One of the riders tonight, Rance said, had a scar on his forearm. Matches the description on this poster close enough to make my neck go cold. Odessa's breath caught. You're saying that man was here? On our land? I'm saying he's riding with somebody's hired guns, and there's only one man in this county paying for hired guns right now. Rance folded the poster back along its worn creases, careful, the way a man folds something that's suddenly gotten heavier than it looks. I've been 3 counties chasing that name, rode into your town chasing it, as a matter of fact, before I ever knew your name or your trouble. And now it isn't 2 separate troubles anymore, it's one. He looked up at her, lamplight catching something old and tired and newly awake all at once behind his eyes. Tangled up tight. The kind of tangle that doesn't come apart clean, no matter how careful a man's hands are. Odessa sat down slow on the crate beside him, the two of them close in the small circle of lamplight while the rest of the dark yard settled back into its usual quiet. Sunday, she said. That's when the wedding's set. License filed, guests told. 4 days now since that afternoon in the street. 3 more till Sunday finds us. 4 days, she repeated, and the number sat between them, heavy and exact, the way numbers always sat with her, not abstract, not distant, but real enough to build a plan around. Somewhere out past the dark tree line, past the north pasture, where 4 riders had come and gone that very night, Garrison Voss was sitting behind his own ledger, in his own lamplight, believing his money and his name would carry him clean through whatever came next. He didn't know yet what was riding into his county, alongside the drought and the debt and the daughter who'd stopped being afraid of him. He didn't know a stranger's business had just become entirely, permanently, his own, but he would. Come Sunday, the whole county would. Morning came in gray over Salt Fork. No color to it yet. Just that flat pewter light that sits on a town before the sun decides whether the day's going to be kind or not. It wasn't going to be kind. Odessa knew that before she even got the coffee going. Knew it the way she knew weather in her knees, in the particular stillness of the yard, in the way her father's rooster hadn't crowed at his usual hour. Something was off. Something was already moving through Salt Fork before she'd even poured the first cup. She found out what by the time she reached the mercantile for flour. Because Ruth Pemberton was standing on the porch with 2 other women, heads bent close, voices dropped low the way voices drop when they're saying something they don't quite believe themselves, but want to believe anyway. Wanted in 3 counties, is what I heard. Voss himself said a marshal's on his way from Amarillo. And to think we let that man sleep in our livery. Odessa stopped walking. Because those words weren't about Wyatt, weren't about the wedding, weren't about anything she'd braced herself for that morning. They were about Rance, Ruth. Odessa's voice cut through the porch chatter clean as a blade. What exactly did you hear? Ruth's face went the particular shade of pink that comes from being caught gossiping by the one person who has every right to be furious about it. Odessa. Garrison's man was through this morning. Said there's a poster. Said this Colby fellow's wanted for robbery down in the Nations, they're saying. Says who? Says Garrison. Odessa almost laughed. Would have, except there was nothing funny in it, nothing funny at all in watching a whole town flip its opinion of a man inside. 12 hours on nothing but a rumor dropped by the very man that stranger had humiliated in the street the day before. Because that's exactly what this was. She saw it plain as her own ledger columns. Garrison Voss couldn't beat Rance Colby with riders in the dark, so now he'd try beating him with something quieter, something that didn't need a single bullet. A story. And stories, once loose in a town this small, ran faster than any horse. He saved me, Ruth. Odessa's voice didn't rise, but it carried. Right there in this street, in front of you, and everybody else who found their feet too heavy to move. And now, one night after his own men got run off our land with nothing worse than a wet collar and a bruised backside, suddenly there's a marshal on the way. Doesn't that timing strike you as convenient? Ruth had the good grace to look ashamed of herself. I didn't think of it that way. Most folks don't. That's rather the point of a rumor like this one. Odessa gathered her flour and turned to go, then paused. Tell whoever else you hear talking. Ask them where the poster actually is. Ask to see it with their own eyes before they let it change how they treat a man who did more for this town in one afternoon than the rest of us managed in 3 weeks. She walked home with her chin up and her basket heavy, and found, somewhere in the walking, that the fear she'd carried through most of the past 3 weeks had gone quiet enough to let something else through, something closer to anger. Clean and the kind that got things done, instead of just sitting in a person's chest going to rot. Rance heard it from Sheriff Loomis himself an hour later, standing in the dust outside the livery with the morning sun finally starting to earn its heat. I'm not accusing you of anything, Loomis said, which was, Rance had learned a long time ago, exactly what a man says right before he accuses you of something. Go on then. Words come through that there's paper on a man matching your description. Robbery down south. That's so, you deny it? Rance looked at him a long moment. Long enough that Loomis shifted his weight, uncomfortable, the way a man shifts when the silence in front of him has more truth in it than any answer would. I've got paper of my own, Rance said finally. On a man. Not on myself. Convenient thing to say. Convenient thing for Garrison Voss to say too. Timing being what it is. Rance's voice didn't rise. Didn't need to. Last night his men shot at an old rancher's fence posts in the dark. This morning there's a rumor loose that makes the whole town scared to look at the fellow who stopped them. You seeing the shape of that, Sheriff, or do I need to draw it plainer? Loomis didn't answer right away, because he was seeing it. He just hadn't decided yet what he intended to do about seeing it. I've got a job to do, Loomis said finally. So do I. And what's that? Rance reached into his coat, slow, careful. Let the sheriff watch his hand the whole way, same as he had in the street the day before. He pulled out the folded poster, edges soft from handling, and held it out. Loomis took it. Read it. His face changed as he read first confusion, then something harder to name, landing somewhere between surprise and a grim kind of understanding. Cutter Boyle, Loomis said quietly. Rode with a crew during the Cimarron robbery. 2 men dead. $11,000 of railroad money never recovered. Rance let that sit. Last night, during that little visit to the Kane place, I saw a scar on one rider's forearm that matches this poster close enough to make my neck go cold. Loomis looked up sharp. You're saying Boyle's here? In Salt Fork, I'm saying he's riding with somebody's hired guns. And there's only one man in this county paying for hired guns right now. The sheriff folded the poster back along its worn creases, slower this time, more careful, like the paper had suddenly gotten heavier in his hands. You should have brought this to me first thing. Would you have believed me first thing? Before this morning's rumor, when half this town already thinks I'm the wanted man walking. Loomis didn't answer that either, because they both already knew the answer, and neither one of them much wanted to say it out loud. He stood there a long moment with the poster still in his hand, and something crossed his face that Rance recognized. He'd seen it before, on other faces in other towns, the particular look of a man doing arithmetic on his own 4 years of watching, and wondering if the sum of it added up to anything worth keeping. 4 years I've worn this star, Loomis said, mostly to himself. 4 years telling myself the next fight would be the one worth the risk. And this one? Loomis didn't answer that either, not out loud. But he folded the poster into his own coat pocket, instead of handing it back. And that, Rance figured, was answer enough for now. Give me a few days, Loomis said. Quiet ones. I've got a bank clerk in Prairie Crossing who owes me a favor or two, and a few names on my own list I never got around to asking hard questions of. If Voss thinks nobody's watching him close, he'll get careless. Men like him always do, sooner or later. Sunday's coming fast, Sheriff. I'm aware of the date, Mr. Colby. Something almost like the old iron came back into Loomis's voice, buried under 4 years of rust but not entirely gone. Give me what days are left before it. I mean to use every one of them. 2 miles north, on the rise of ground, with the view clear to the horizon, Garrison Voss sat across from a man most of the county had never seen up close, and hoped never to. Cutter Boyle didn't look like much at first glance. Middling height. Plain face, the kind that forgot itself in a crowd. It was only the eyes that gave him away. If a person knew to look flat, patient, the eyes of a man who'd learned a long time ago that most trouble in this world could be solved by simply being willing to go further than the other fellow. Your men made a mess of things last night, Garrison said. Your rancher's got a guard dog now. Boyle didn't sound troubled by the fact, just stated it, plain, the way he seemed to state everything. Man knows what he's doing. Didn't kill anybody, though he could have twice over. That tells me something. Tells you what? Tells me he's the kind who likes clean hands. Men like that are slower to finish a thing than men who don't care how it looks after. Boyle turned his hat over once in his own lap, an idle gesture that somehow managed to look more threatening than anything Wyatt had ever done with the same motion. You still want the girl handled quiet. I want this county's water rights settled. How it gets settled is no longer my concern so long as my name stays out of it. Your name's already halfway into it, Voss. Bank ledgers don't forge themselves. Boyle's mouth curved, not quite a smile. But that's your trouble, not mine. I'll do what I came to do. In exchange, that debt of mine disappears clean. Same as we agreed. It disappears. Then we understand each other. Boyle rose unhurried and settled his hat back on. Give me a few more days to read the ground properly. A man in my line of work doesn't rush the finish. Rushing's how a man ends up on the wrong side of a poster. He left the way he'd come, quiet, unremarkable, the kind of man who could walk through the middle of Salt Fork at noon, and nobody would remember his face by supper. Garrison watched him go from the porch and told himself, the way he'd been telling himself for 6 years now, that whatever came next was simply business, nothing more. He didn't entirely believe it anymore. He noticed that, distantly, the way a man notices a crack in a foundation, he's already decided not to look at too closely. He poured himself a drink instead, and didn't examine the thought any further. The county land office sat 2 towns over, in Prairie Crossing, a squat brick building that smelled like dust and old paper and decades of other people's disputes settled in ink. Odessa had ridden out at first light with her father's old mare, and a folded copy of the bank ledger tucked inside her coat, the way a person carries something they're afraid of losing and afraid of being caught with, both at once. The ride gave her time to think, which she hadn't much wanted, because thinking too long about any of this tended to circle back to the same place, her mother's grave, out past the north fence line, and the particular stubbornness that had kept her father from ever selling that stretch of land, no matter how bad the drought got. She understood it better than she let on most days. Some ground a person didn't measure in dollars. Her mother had died there, more or less worn thin by 3 failed harvests, and a fever that hadn't needed to be fatal if the family had had coin left over for a proper doctor. Amos had buried her under the one cottonwood on the property that still put out shade worth sitting in, and some part of him, Odessa suspected, had never quite left that spot since. Which was exactly the kind of soft, human weakness Garrison Voss had built an entire fortune out of finding and pressing on, gentle as a bruise, until a man signed whatever paper got put in front of him, just to make the pressing stop. The clerk was an older man with spectacles perched low on his nose, and the particular patience of somebody who'd spent 30 years being asked the same 3 questions by increasingly desperate people. Kane, he said, running a finger down a ledger of his own, older, thicker, bound in cracked leather. Kane, he stopped, tapped the page. Here, that's my father's land. He turned the book toward her, and here's the water survey from, let's see, 1874, 7 years back. Odessa leaned in. Read it again, because the first reading didn't quite land right, didn't quite settle into her chest the way true things settle, because the survey plainly, clearly, in ink gone brown with age, showed the water rights along that stretch of Cottonwood Creek. The exact stretch Garrison Voss had been squeezing her family over for 3 years belonged, by original filing, to the Kane name, not disputed, not shared. Filed and recorded 7 years before Garrison Voss ever bought the adjoining land at all. This can't be right, she said. It's right as anything in this office ever gets. The clerk adjusted his spectacles. Of course, plenty of folks don't know to come looking, and plenty of folks who do come looking find somebody's already had a copy pulled and quietly misfiled somewhere. It won't turn up easy. Odessa went very still. Somebody's already asked for this record. Man came through about, 2 years back now, paid for a copy, never said why. The clerk squinted at his own notes, trying to recall. Voss. That was the name. Garrison Voss. The room seemed to tilt, just slightly, the way a floor tilts, under a person who's just understood something they'd suspected, but hadn't let themselves fully believe. Because if Garrison Voss had known for 2 years, at least, that the water rights he'd been strangling her family over didn't actually belong to him at all, then none of this was about debt, never had been. It was about making sure nobody ever found the one piece of paper that would end his hold on Cottonwood Creek for good. Odessa's hands were steady when she asked the clerk for a certified copy. Her voice was steady too, but underneath, something in her chest had gone from frightened to something colder. Something with edges. Because a man who hides a filed public record from the very family it belongs to isn't protecting a business deal. He's protecting a theft. And Odessa Kane had spent her whole life keeping other people's numbers honest. She wasn't about to let this one slide by uncorrected. Not for Garrison Voss. Not for anybody. She rode home with the certified copy pressed flat against her chest, under her coat, same as she'd carried the ledger out that morning, and found her father waiting on the porch when she arrived. Worry carved deep into every line of his face. "Well," Amos asked, before she'd even swung down off the mare. She told him all of it. Watched his face move through disbelief, then something like grief. Then finally, something she hadn't seen on him in longer than she could remember, a kind of clean, quiet fury that had nowhere near enough fear mixed into it to weaken it. 7 years, Amos said when she'd finished. 7 years that water's been rightfully ours, and I let that man bully me into believing otherwise because I never once thought to ask the county, to check. You didn't know to ask. I should have. He sat down heavy on the porch step, the same step she'd sat on the day before, and looked out toward the north fence line, toward the one cottonwood that threw shade over the only grave that mattered to him. Your mother always said I trusted the wrong men's word over the right paperwork. Seems she was righter about that than even she knew. We can fix it now, Papa. Can we? He looked at her, and something in his face had shifted, some old weightlifting just slightly to make room for a newer, sharper kind of resolve. Then I suppose we'd best figure out how. That same afternoon, restless with the news still sitting heavy in her chest, Odessa saddled the mare again and rode out to the Hollis place, 3 sections over, telling herself she simply wanted confirmation that the name on Wyatt's list matched a family she actually knew. She found Martha Hollis hanging wash in the yard, 3 children underfoot, and the woman's face went carefully blank the moment she recognized who was riding up the lane. Odessa Kane. Martha's voice was polite in the particular way that meant caution more than warmth. Don't often see you out this far. I won't take much of your time, Martha. I wanted to ask you something, and I'd understand if you'd rather not answer it. Ask then. Do you know what your family's note with Garrison Voss says? The actual figure. Something shifted behind Martha's eyes, quick and wary. Why do you ask a thing like that? Because I think it might be wrong, and I think I might be able to prove it, if you'll let me. Martha set down the shirt she'd been pinning, slow, and looked at Odessa a long moment, weighing something Odessa couldn't quite read. $900, Martha said finally, quiet, like the number cost her something just to say out loud. Against 40 acres in the well. Due end of this season, same as it's been due 3 seasons running, because we can never quite scrape together the whole of it before he adds more interest onto what's left. Would you let me see the note itself, if you still have it? Martha disappeared into the house a moment and came back with a folded paper, worn soft at the creases from handling, and held it out like she wasn't entirely sure she should be handing it to anyone. Odessa read it there in the yard, her own hands going cold despite the afternoon heat, because the figure written there, $900, sat exactly the wrong distance from what the original bank ledger would show, if the pattern held the way she suspected it would. I think this needs checking against the bank's own record, Odessa said, the real one. Not the one Garrison shows the examiner, and if it's wrong, what then? Martha's voice had an edge to it now, something between hope and the particular exhaustion of a woman who'd learned not to trust hope too quickly, not after years of watching it disappoint her. We can't afford a fight with Garrison Voss, Odessa. Man like that, he'd ruin us worse than the debt already has, just to prove a point to the rest of the county. He might try. Odessa folded the note back carefully and handed it over. But there's more than just your family caught in this, Martha. There's mine. There's at least 10 others, according to what I've seen. And a man can ruin one family easy enough. It gets a great deal harder once 11 of them stand up together and say the same true thing at the same time. Martha studied her a long moment, something working behind her tired eyes. You're serious about this? Dead serious. Then you come find me when the time's right. Whatever's coming, I'll stand where I need to stand. Martha's voice had steadied, some of the old caution burning away to reveal something harder underneath, sharper, the particular resolve of a woman who'd been waiting a long while for somebody to finally hand her a reason to stop being afraid. I've got 3 children who deserve better than growing up watching their mother flinch every time a Voss rides past our gate. Odessa rode home as the light went long and gold across the pasture, carrying with her the particular weight of a promise made to somebody besides herself for the first time in this whole ordeal, and found somewhere in the writing, that the weight didn't feel like a burden at all. It felt like the first true foundation she'd stood on in longer than she could remember. Declan Prescott hadn't slept right since the shots in the dark, the water barrel spraying cold against the back of his own neck, the particular sound Cutter Boyle made afterward low, ugly, satisfied like a man who'd enjoyed something he shouldn't have. Declan had ridden for Garrison Voss for 6 years. Foreman. Now. Trusted. If trust was even the word for whatever kept a man loyal when the alternative was losing everything, because that's what it was. Not loyalty. Leverage. 3 years back, Declan's own brother had run up debt with a cattle buyer down in Amarillo. Gambling debt, the ugly kind, and Garrison had quietly bought that paper off the buyer before it ever came due, never called it in, never needed to. Just let Declan know once, plain and simple, over a glass of whiskey on that same wide porch, with the view clear to the horizon. I own your brother's debt now, Declan. Man'd hate to see what happens to a fellow who can't pay what he owes. 3 years of that hanging over him. 3 years of doing things he didn't sleep easy after doing, telling himself each time that the next task would be the last one, and watching that promise prove itself a lie every single time. He had a wife now. A boy not yet 3 years old, with his mother's eyes and a laugh that undid something in Declan's chest every time he heard it, through the cabin window coming home from another long day, carrying out somebody else's cruelty. He'd told himself more than once that he was staying quiet for their sake, protecting them. But quiet had a way of curdling into something uglier the longer a man let it sit, and 3 years of curdling had brought him right up to the edge of something he could no longer talk himself back from. So when he found Rance Colby alone at the livery that evening, currying the roan mare in the low lantern light, Declan almost turned around twice before he made himself walk the rest of the way in. Colby. Rance didn't stop brushing. Prescott. I'm not here to start trouble. Didn't figure you were. Man starting trouble doesn't usually announce himself first. Declan's jaw worked. He glanced back toward the open door, checking the street behind him, the old habit of a man who'd spent years making sure the wrong eyes weren't watching. I want to tell you something, and I want you to understand I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it because I've got a conscience I can't seem to kill off, no matter how hard Garrison Voss tries to help me. I'm listening, Cutter Boyle. Declan said the name low, like it might carry further than his voice intended. He's not just riding with our crew for pay. Garrison's hiding him. Been hiding him for near 2 months now. There's a line shack out past the North Ridge nobody's supposed to know about. Rance's hands went still on the horse's coat. Why? Because Boyle owes Garrison a favor now. A big one. And Garrison intends to collect it. Declan's voice dropped further. If the Kane girl keeps digging where she's been digging, and word is she's been digging plenty, Garrison means to have Boyle handle it, quiet-like. Make it look like an accident nobody can trace back to a ranch 2 miles north of town. The lantern light flickered. Rance's face didn't change, but something behind his eyes went very cold, very fast. You're telling me Garrison Voss is willing to have a woman killed to protect a piece of paper? I'm telling you I've seen what that man's willing to do when something threatens what he's built. Declan's hands were shaking slightly, and he pressed them flat against his own thighs, the same gesture Rance had seen Amos Kane make the night before. I've got a wife, Colby, and a boy not yet 3 years old. I can't stand against Garrison Voss alone, but I'm not going to carry a killing on my conscience either. Not this one. Not a girl who never did a single thing except try to keep her own family's books honest. Rance set the brush down slow. Why tell me? Because you're the only man in this county who stood up to him without flinching. Declan met his eyes then, finally, for the first time since he'd walked in. And because somebody's got to. You'd be risking that brother's debt coming due, telling me this. I've been risking it every day for 3 years just by staying quiet. Declan's voice had gone rough. There's a difference between a debt and a soul, Colby. Took me longer than it should have to remember that. My boy's going to grow up in this county one way or another. I'd rather he grow up in one where his father did something worth telling him about than one where I kept my hands clean by looking the other way. Rance studied him a long moment. Something in his own chest, old and tired and stubbornly still capable of surprise, shifted just slightly. Sheriff Loomis is asking quiet questions of his own, Rance said. Bank clerk in Prairie Crossing, a few names on his own list. Might be worth your while to have a word with him too, careful like. Man's finally decided 4 years of watching was long enough. I'll consider it. Consider it fast, Prescott. Sunday's not waiting on any of us to work up our nerve. Declan nodded once. Quick, and slipped back out into the dark the way he'd come, leaving Rance alone with the lantern light and a great deal more to carry than he'd had an hour before. Wyatt found Odessa at the fence line the next evening, well past dusk, well past the hour a proper visit would have called for. He came on foot, not horseback, the way a man moves when he doesn't want the sound of hooves announcing him before he's ready to be announced. "You shouldn't be here," Odessa said. "Not unkind. Just true. I know. Your father finds out. I know that too." Wyatt's hands were jammed deep in his coat pockets, shoulders hunched against a chill that had more to do with nerves than weather. "I've been thinking about what you said, about the 1100 against the 400, and I went looking myself." He pulled a folded paper from inside his coat, copied it out of Pa's private ledger. "Not the one he shows the bank examiner. The other one." Odessa took it, read it in the low lantern light spilling from the barn behind her, and felt her pulse pick up despite every effort to keep it steady, because it was there, in Garrison Voss's own hand, a running account of every family in the county he'd inflated debt against going back 6 years. The Canes weren't even close to the worst of it. "There's 11 families on this list," she said quietly. 12, counting yours." Wyatt's voice had none of the crack it carried in the street the day before last. Something in him had hardened since then, gone quiet and resolved in a way that made him look older than his 26 years. "I've watched my father build this county on other people's fear for as long as I can remember, and I never let myself see it plain until this week. I don't want any part of it anymore. And I sure don't want to marry a woman on the back of a lie I helped my own father tell." "Wyatt, I'm not asking for anything from you, Odessa. Not forgiveness. Not anything." He looked away, toward the dark tree line, toward the direction of his father's house, sitting on its rise of ground, 2 miles north. "I just needed somebody in this county to know the truth was sitting in that house the whole time. Even if I was too much of a coward to say so out loud until now." "You're not a coward, Wyatt. Cowards don't walk 2 miles in the dark to hand somebody the one thing that could end their own inheritance." That seemed to land somewhere he hadn't braced for. He looked at her a long moment, something unguarded moving across his face. "I used to think I loved you, you know, back when we were younger, before Pa ever mentioned a wedding. I know, you never once looked back at me the same way." "No," she said, gentle but honest, the way she said most things. "I didn't. I understand that now. Watching you these past few days. You've got a fire in you I never had the sense to notice before, and I don't imagine it was ever mine to notice in the first place." A faint, tired smile crossed his face. Colby's a lucky man, whether he's figured that out himself yet or not. "Wyatt, I'm not saying it to make you uncomfortable. I'm saying it because it's true, and I've decided I'm done not saying true things out of politeness." He straightened his shoulders, some of the old boy in him falling away entirely. "Whatever happens Sunday, I want you to know I intend to make it right. However I'm able to, thank you," Odessa said, and meant it, plain and simple, the way she meant every true thing she said. He didn't answer further, just nodded once, quick, and disappeared back into the dark the way he'd come. Garrison found the private ledger's lock forced open the next morning. He didn't say anything at first, just sat behind his desk a long while, the broken lock sitting in his open palm, like something he couldn't quite believe he was holding. Then he called for Wyatt. His son came in slow, and something in the set of his shoulders told Garrison everything he needed to know before a few stees joined them. "You went through my desk." "I did, and copied out pages. To give to that Kane girl I'd wait, or to the Colby man." Garrison's voice stayed level, dangerously level, the voice of a man doing arithmetic on how much damage had already been done and how much more could still be stopped. "Do you understand what you've done?" "I understand what you've done, Pa. For 6 years. Wyatt's voice shook, but he didn't look away. 11 families, not counting the Canes. 11 families you squeezed dry on debts that were half again, sometimes double, what they actually owed. And you sat me down at that same desk and called it business. Called it a legacy you were building for me. I built this ranch. You built it on lies people couldn't afford to catch you telling." Wyatt's fists were clenched at his sides now, whole body rigid. "I won't marry her on a debt you invented out of thin air, Pa. I already told her that. I meant it." Garrison rose slowly from behind the desk. For a moment, something crossed his face that looked almost like the old warmth, the almost respect he'd shown in this same room days before. Then it hardened, same as it always did, back into something colder. "You've made your choice then," Garrison said quietly. "Understand it comes with consequences. This ranch, this name. Everything I've built, none of it waits around for a son who'd rather stand with strangers against his own blood. Then I suppose I've already lost it, Wyatt said. Guess I find out today whether that was ever really mine to lose in the first place. He walked out without waiting for an answer. Garrison stood alone in the study a long while after, the broken lock still sitting cold in his open palm, and for the first time, in longer than he could remember, something that might have been doubt moved through him. He didn't let it stay long, because doubt wasn't useful to a man mere hours out from losing everything he'd spent a lifetime building. What was useful was action, and Garrison Voss had never once in his life let a threat go unanswered. He sent word to the North Ridge instead, a single line carried by a boy on a fast horse. Whatever Cutter Boyle intended to do about the cane trouble, he had better be prepared to do it today, in front of the whole county if it came to that, because there wasn't going to be a tomorrow left do it quiet in. Amos found Rance checking his rifle on the porch steps that same morning, methodical, unhurried, the particular calm of a man preparing for something he'd already made peace with in his own mind. Mind if I sit a spell? Amos lowered himself onto the step beside him without waiting for an answer, his bad knee complaining the whole way down. Your porch. Suppose it is at that. Amos was quiet a moment, watching Rance's work through the familiar motions of the rifle's care. I never did thank you properly. For that first afternoon, wasn't necessary. Wasn't necessary and isn't the same thing as isn't deserved. Amos's voice had gone rough at the edges. I've spent 3 weeks watching my own daughter carry a weight I put on her, Mr. Colby, and not once in those 3 weeks did I find the nerve to do what you did without even knowing our names. That's a hard thing for a father to sit with. Rance set the rifle down across his knees, unhurried, and considered the older man a long moment. You're not the villain in this story, Amos. Whatever you're telling yourself in the dark some nights. Feels like I might be, some mornings. Villains don't sit up worrying whether they've done right by their children. Villains don't notice the weight at all. Rance's voice carried the particular steadiness of a man thought this through more than once, on more than one porch with more than one frightened father. Garrison Voss built a fortune finding men exactly like you. Good men, worn thin by bad seasons, easier to bend than to break outright. That's not weakness on your part. That's just what desperate arithmetic does to a person when there's no honest sum left that adds up to enough. Amos was quiet a long while, looking out toward the north fence line, toward the cottonwood that marked his wife's grave. She'd have liked you, he said finally. My wife had a nose for decent men, same as our daughters apparently inherited. Took her all of one look at me across a church social to decide I was worth the trouble, and she was usually right about that kind of thing. I'll take the compliment, even secondhand. Wasn't entirely a compliment. She also had a nose for men who didn't stay put. If I recall the exact conversation we had about my own cousin, years back, Amos allowed himself a thin, tired smile. You planning on staying put, Colby, once this business with Garrison finishes itself out? Or is Salt Fork just one more town on a longer road? Rance didn't answer right away. Turned the rifle over once in his hands, considering the question with more weight than its plain phrasing suggested it deserved. Wasn't planning on staying anywhere when I rode in, he said finally. Man in my line of work doesn't usually get the luxury of planning that far ahead. And now I've got a debt to collect 2 counties over, and a fee attached to it I've been chasing 3 states for. He looked toward the house, toward the window where lamplight had begun to glow gold, against the coming evening where Odessa's shadow moved every so often across the curtain. After that, I couldn't rightly say. Depends some on what waits for me once the collecting's finished. Amos followed his gaze toward that same window, and something in his weathered face eased, just slightly, the particular relief of a father allowing himself, for the first time in weeks, to hope for something on his daughter's behalf, instead of merely fearing for her. Well, he said, pushing himself up off the step with a grunt. Guess we'll see what waits then. Come tomorrow. Guess we will. Rance found Odessa at the fence line that same afternoon, both of them drawn there separately by the particular restlessness that settles into a body the day before something enormous is about to happen, whether that body wants to admit it or not. Wyatt's copies, she said before he'd even finished walking up. 11 other families, plus mine. Plus the water rights the county clerk says were mine all along, filed 7 years before Garrison ever tried to claim otherwise. I heard some of it from Prescott. Rance leaned against the rail beside her, close but not too close. The particular careful distance of 2 people who both know something is shifting between them, and neither one's quite ready to say its name yet. There's more you should know, and none of it's easy hearing. She turned to face him. Tell me anyway. So he did, Cutter Boyle. The line shack passed the north ridge. Garrett Ranson's willingness, according to Declan, and Rance had no reason yet to doubt the man. Not after what it cost him to walk into that livery and say it out loud, to have Boyle deal with Odessa quiet enough that no trail would ever lead back to a ranch 2 miles north of town. Odessa didn't flinch, didn't gasp, didn't press a hand to her chest, the way Rance half expected, half braced for. She just went very. The stillness of a woman doing math on a threat, the same way she'd do math on any other column of figures that needed squaring up. Then we finish this tomorrow, she said, before he finishes it his way first. Odessa, I've spent my whole life being careful, Rance. Careful with money, careful with my father's pride, careful with what I let myself want, because wanting things out loud in this town gets a girl my size laughed at, and I got tired of being laughed at a long time before you rode into that street. Her voice didn't waver. I'm done being careful. I want that man's lies laid out in front of the whole county, where nobody can look away from them anymore, and I want it done in his own barn, in front of his own guests, on the exact day he chose to force this on me. Rance studied her a long moment in the dark. Something in his chest, something he hadn't let himself name yet either, settled a little further into place. You're not scared, he said. Not quite a question. I'm terrified, Odessa said. I've just gotten better at not letting it decide anything for me anymore. He almost smiled at that. Almost. There's something I keep thinking, she said, quieter now, some of the steel softening at the edges. 4 days ago I was just a girl with a ledger nobody, outside my own kitchen, cared to look at. And now half the county's future's tangled up with mine, and I can't decide if that frightens me, or if it's the first thing in years that's made me feel like I matter to something bigger than my father's supper table. Maybe it's both. Maybe it is. She looked up at him, steady in the last of the day's light. Whatever happens tomorrow, I'm glad you stopped your horse. So am I. Neither of them moved from the fence for a long while after that. Just stood there together in the fading light, close enough now that their shoulders nearly touched, watching the same stretch of sky that had watched over one night of gunfire, one broken lock, 11 ruined families, and a girl who had finally, entirely, stopped waiting for somebody else to decide the shape of her own life. Because come tomorrow, one way or another, Salt Fork was going to find out exactly what Garrison Voss had built his whole world on, and exactly how fast a lie that size could burn once the right match finally found it. Loomis rode out to the Kane place himself late that evening, once the last of the daylight had finally given up the sky, dust heavy on his coat, and found Rance still out by the corral fence where Odessa had left him. Made some progress today, Loomis said, swinging down off his horse, tired in the particular way of a man who'd spent a whole day doing more honest work than he had in longer than he cared to admit. Bank clerk and Prairie Crossing finally talked. Once I made it plain I already had enough to hang the both of them together if he kept stalling. Says Garrison paid him separate, in cash, each time a note needed adjusting upward. Kept no record of it himself. The fool figured that made him safe. Man's confession on paper, signed and witnessed not 2 hours past. Loomis patted his coat pocket. And I've got 3 families besides the Kanes willing to put their own names to statements. Once they understood I meant to see this through, regardless of what Garrison threatened in return. That's more than I expected out of 2 days' work, Sheriff. 4 years I spent expecting nothing much out of myself. Something wry crossed Loomis's tired face. Turns out a man can surprise himself. It's insufficient reason and sufficiently short notice to talk himself out of trying. Odessa spoke to the Hollis family herself this afternoon. Martha Hollis said she'd stand up when the time came. And we've got the makings of something real come Sunday. Loomis looked out toward the darkening yard, toward the north pasture where gunfire had cracked the night not 2 evenings past. I mean to be in that barn myself, Colby. Whatever happens. Man watches long enough from the sidelines. Sooner or later he's got to decide whether he's a sheriff or just a fellow wearing another man's old badge. Which are you? Loomis considered the question a long moment, and something settled in his face that hadn't been there 4 days back. Reckon we'll both find out Sunday, he said, and swung back up onto his horse to ride the long road back toward town before full dark caught him on it. Sunday came in clear and hot, the kind of panhandle morning that promised worse by noon and never once apologized for the promise. Odessa stood in front of the small cracked mirror in her room, looking at a woman she barely recognized. Not because the dress was wrong. The dress was fine. Blue, her mother's, let out at the seams the night before with her own careful stitches. Because the woman in that mirror didn't look afraid. And Odessa had spent so many weeks bracing, for afraid that its absence felt like standing on ground that had just, without warning, stopped shifting under her feet. She turned sideways once, studying the fit of the dress across her shoulders, and caught herself doing the measuring thing. The habit of finding fault before anybody else got the chance to find it first. Big through the arms. Never was going to be the kind of bride the county pictured when it pictured one. Then she stopped herself, deliberate, the way she'd been teaching herself to do all week. Because that wasn't the woman in the mirror anymore. That was an old voice borrowed from other people's mouths, and she was done carrying voices that weren't her own. "You don't have to do this," her father said from the doorway. Voice rough, rougher than she'd heard it in years. "I know. You could still refuse to go at all. Let the license lapse. Let the county sort out." "Papa." She turned, met his eyes, which hadn't happened easy between them in 3 weeks, and found something steadier looking back at her than she expected. "I'm not going to that barn to get married. I'm going to end this. There's a difference, and I need you standing next to me when I make it plain to every soul in that county." Amos's throat worked. His hand went to his coat, where a folded packet sat close against his chest, the old ledger. The county deed, everything they'd built these past few days, into something sharp enough to cut through 6 years of Garrison Voss's lies in one Sunday morning. "Your mother would be proud of you," he said. "I should have told you that 3 weeks ago instead of staring at my own boots. You're telling me now. Better late than never, I suppose." "Better late," Odessa agreed, and something in her chest loosened just slightly, the way it had the day. A stranger stopped his horse in the middle of a street and refused to keep riding past what he saw. She reached for her hat, then paused, and looked back at her father a moment longer. "Whatever happens in that barn today," she said, "I need you to know I'm not angry at you anymore. I was, for a while. But you're not the one who built a fortune out of other people's fear, Papa. You're just a man who got caught in somebody else's trap, same as 11 other families in this county did. Doesn't make it hurt less, knowing that." "No," she agreed, "but it makes it easier to forgive." Amos's eyes went bright, and he looked away quick, out toward the yard, toward the road that would carry them both north within the hour. "Let's go finish this," he said, once his voice had steadied enough to trust it. Ruth Pemberton was waiting at the gate when they came out, hands twisting the strap of her own reticule, looking like a woman who'd walked the better part of a mile, working up her nerve the whole way. "I heard what's planned for today," Ruth said, before Odessa had even reached the fence. "Thought you should know. I told 3 other women what you said to me, about asking to see the poster with their own eyes before believing it. Told them what I saw with mine, in that street 4 days back." "Thank you, Ruth." "Don't thank me yet. I should have said it plainer the day it happened, instead of standing there swallowing gossip like it was gospel." Ruth's chin came up, some of her old nervousness burning away into something steadier. "I intend to be in that barn today, whatever happens. Man saved you in this street, and half this county stood by and let a lie turn us against him inside a single morning. Seems the least I can do is stand somewhere better this time. That means more than I can rightly say. Then don't say it. Just let me walk beside you as far as the barn doors, and we'll call it even." Ruth managed a thin, nervous smile. "I brought pie, too. Seemed wrong to show up to a reckoning empty-handed, whatever else it turns out to be." Amos, coming up behind them with the oilcloth packet still pressed against his chest, allowed himself the ghost of a smile at that, the first easy one Odessa had seen cross his face in longer than she could count. "Only in Salt Fork," he said, "would a woman bring pie to watch a fraud get exposed." "Well, somebody's got to feed the crowd once the shouting's finished," Ruth said, entirely serious. "Might as well be good pie." They walked together as far as the gate, the 3 of them, and Rance falling in a half-step behind, and Odessa found herself grateful, in a way she hadn't expected to feel on a morning this heavy, for the particular comfort of not walking into the fire entirely alone. 3 weeks back she'd stood in a street with nobody, stepping forward. Today she had her father beside her, a stranger who'd become considerably more than a stranger, riding just behind, and a woman who'd once whispered rumors now walking at her shoulder, with a pie balanced in her arms like it was the most natural thing in the world. It wasn't nothing, she thought. It wasn't nearly nothing at all. By 9 o'clock the road to the Voss barn was crowded thick with wagons and buggies, half the county coming out to watch Garrison Voss's son get married, whether the bride wanted marrying or not. Rance rode in an hour early, Odessa beside him, Amos following on the family's oldest mare, with the packet wrapped in oilcloth against his chest like something liable to catch fire on its own. They rode mostly in silence, the 3 of them, the dust rising gold around the horse's legs, same as it had that first afternoon in the street, and Odessa found herself thinking, strange and sideways, that the whole county's story seemed to keep circling back to dust and gold light, over and over, as though the land itself couldn't decide whether to bless what was coming or simply bear witness to it. The barn had been swept clean and hung with white bunting for the occasion. Lanterns strung along the rafters for the evening's dancing garrison had already promised the whole county. And at the front of it, beneath a hastily built arch of cut cottonwood branches, a traveling preacher stood turning his hat over in his hands, looking like a man who'd rather be anywhere else on God's own earth. Ruth Pemberton stood near the front row, and when her eyes found Odessa's across the crowded barn, something passed between them that wasn't quite an apology but was trying hard to be one. Odessa nodded once, small, and let it be enough for now. There'd be time later to mend what a rumor had frayed. Today wasn't that day. Garrison Voss saw them come through the barn doors and didn't so much as change his footing. Mr. Colby. His voice carried easy across the gathered crowd, pitched for an audience. I did wonder if you'd have the nerve to show your face on my own land. Especially given what the marshal's likely to find, once he finally rides in from Amarillo. Wouldn't have missed it, Rance said. Especially once I learned what your private ledger says. Versus what yours quoted in the street 4 days back. Something flickered across Garrison's face. Gone fast. But Wyatt, standing near the arch in a coat too formal for what he clearly intended to do in it, caught the flicker too, and his jaw set in a way it hadn't the last time Rance had seen him. Amos stepped forward, oilcloth trembling slightly in his hands, unwrapped the packet for the assembled county to see, and his voice cracked on the first words before steadying by the third sentence, the way a man's voice does when the truth finally gets heavier than the fear of speaking it. $400. His words carried clean across the quiet barn. That's what your own bank recorded against my land 3 years back, Garrison. In your own clerk's hand. Not $1,100. Somebody added $700 to my family's debt sometime this past winter. He held up the second paper. And this, he said, is a county land survey. Filed 18 and 74. Showing the Cottonwood Creek water rights you've squeezed my family over for 3 years never belonged to you at all. They were mine. Recorded 7 years before you ever bought the land next to it. You've known that for 2 years, Garrison. Ever since you paid the clerk in Prairie Crossing for a copy of it yourself. The barn had gone the particular kind of quiet a crowd goes when it senses a story turning right there in front of it, rather than behind some closed door where these stories usually turn unseen. Careful, Amos. Garrison's voice had dropped, low and dangerous. Accusing a man of fraud in front of half the county is a serious thing, then prove me wrong. Amos didn't flinch. Bring your own ledger out here. Let the whole county watch the preacher read the figures for himself. Garrison didn't move to do that, and the not moving told the barn everything the figures would have told them anyway. Wyatt stepped forward then, to stand beside Amos, and turned to face his own father across the space where a wedding was supposed to have happened. There's 11 more families on the list I copied out of your desk. Pa, Wyatt said, loud enough to carry. 11, besides the Canes. I expect most of them are standing in this barn right now, wondering the same thing I've been wondering all week. Whether the debt they've been breaking their backs to pay off was ever honest to begin with. A murmur moved through the crowd. Somewhere near the back, a man Odessa half recognized one of the Hollis family. She thought, 3 sections over, went very pale and turned to his wife, whispering something urgent. Martha Hollis rose from her seat then, her husband's hand finding hers, and her voice carried clear and unshaking across the barn. $900, she said. That's what our note says, Garrison. I've got it right here if anyone cares to compare it against whatever your bank's own records actually show. She held up her folded paper, worn soft from years of handling. Odessa Kane came to my yard 3 days back and asked me a question nobody in this county's had the nerve to ask out loud in 6 years. I intend to answer it out loud now, in front of every soul who'll listen. 2 more families rose after her, one by one, papers in hand, voices shaking but steady enough to carry, and Garrison Voss stood at the front of his own barn watching 6 years of carefully built silence come apart in the space of a few short minutes, faster than any fire could have managed on its own. This is a lynch mob dressed up as a wedding party, Garrison said, though his lost the easy authority it carried when Rance and the Canes had first walked through the doors. No, Amos said. This is a county finally doing its own arithmetic, Garrison. Same as you've been doing to us for years. Only this time the numbers are honest. It was in that charged, trembling quiet, the whole barn holding its breath together, watching a lifetime of quiet fear finally curdle into something louder. That Declan Prescott, standing near the back doors with his hat pulled low, first noticed the man shifting at the edge of the crowd. Broad-shouldered, sleeve pushed up just enough to show a scar, jagged, curved at the end like a fishhook. Cutter Boyle had come to watch, same as everyone else. Except he hadn't come for the wedding. He'd come because Garrison had sent word the night before that the Kane business needed handling, quiet-like, before it went any further than a barn full of witnesses. And now, with the whole county's attention fixed on Amos Kane's shaking hands and the papers in them, Boyle had judged this the moment. Everyone looking the wrong direction. Everyone's guard down, he judged wrong. Rance saw him at the same moment Declan did. "Boyle," Rance said. Not loud. Didn't need to be, same as it never had. The man's head snapped around. And whatever calculation ran through him in that half-second, stay quiet, brazen it out, or run, landed on none of those. And instead on the one option that ruins everything for everybody standing near him. He went for his gun. Rance's hands moved faster. Not toward his own revolver first. Toward the nearest thing that would stop the shot from finding anybody standing in front of it, a bale of hay, shoved hard into Boyle's path, throwing his aim wide as the shot cracked out and buried itself in the rafters instead of a body. The barn erupted into motion, screaming, bodies shoving toward the doors. The preacher, the Hollis family, half the county's women in Sunday dresses, all trying to move at once through space built for maybe a third that many people. One of Boyle's crew, the same rider who'd gone down hard in the mud 3 nights back, cursing loud enough to wake the county, scrambled for his own fallen revolver in the chaos of shifting bodies, and in his panic knocked the nearest lantern clean off its rafter hook. The bunting caught before anyone in that crowded barn had properly registered the sound of glass breaking. Fire moved through dry cotton and old timber faster than any of the 60-odd neighbors in that barn had braced themselves for. A hungry orange line racing up the white bunting toward the rafters, and the barn, dressed for a wedding, filled instead with smoke and shouting, and the particular scramble of a crowd remembering all at once that there were only 2 doors out. Rance got Odessa moving toward the near door, with one hand pressed flat against her back, steady, steering her clear of the worst of the crush. And it was Amos turning back to make sure his daughter was ahead of him, the way a father does, without even deciding to who took Boyle's wild, panicked shot high in the shoulder, instead of letting it find anyone standing behind him. The old man went down hard against a hitching post just outside the barn doors. Odessa's cry of his name was the first unguarded sound she'd made since the afternoon on Salt Forks Main Street 4 days and a lifetime ago. "Papa, I'm here." Rance was already there, already kneeling, already pressing his own coat hard against the wound, with the kind of steady, practiced calm that came from more battlefields than he'd ever tell a soul about. "Bleeding's bad, but it's not the kind that kills a man quick, Odessa. Look at me." She looked at him, wild-eyed, terrified in a way she hadn't let herself be terrified in front of anybody. Not once, not through the whole town, watching her drag down the street, not through a night of gunfire in the dark. "He's going to be all right," Rance said. Steady, certain, the kind of certain a person only earns by having been wrong about it before, and living long enough to learn how to be right. "You don't know that." "No," he admitted, "but I know panic won't help him, and I know you're stronger than panic. Press here, hard as you can stand to." She pressed. Her hands didn't shake, not once, though everything else in her wanted to. Some part of her mind, distant and strange, noted that fact the way she'd note a column of figures adding up correctly for once. "Good. That's good. Keep pressing." Behind them, the barn's roof timbers had started to groan, and half the county's men had already formed a bucket line running from the stock trough, working fast and grim in the particular silence people fall into when the thing burning in front of them used to be somebody's whole livelihood. Wyatt found Cutter Boyle trying to slip out through the smoke toward the corral, saddle half thrown over a stolen horse moving fast and low. Boyle, the man, spun, gun already half raised. Wyatt didn't have a weapon on him, hadn't thought to bring one to his own wedding, but he didn't step back either. Something in him, 6 years of watching his father build a life on other people's fear, 4 days of finally seeing it plain, had run clean out of room for stepping back from anything. "You're not riding off my father's land," Wyatt said. "Not after what you just did in there. Get out of my way, boy." "No." Boyle's finger tightened on the trigger, which was the exact moment Rance came around the corner of the burning barn at a dead run, Having handed Amos off to Declan and 2 other men from the bucket line, having seen Wyatt standing alone and unarmed in front of a cornered killer with nothing but his own 2 hands and whatever nerve he had left. Rance didn't shoot to kill. Hadn't wanted to, not once through this whole ugly business, not even now. He put a round through Boyle's gun hand instead, close enough and clean enough that the man's weapon spun off into the dirt, and Boyle went down with a scream that had considerably less menace in it than every sound he'd made up to that point. Wyatt was on him before he'd finished falling. Not gentle about it either. 6 years of quiet anger finally finding one single useful place to land. "Hold him," Rance said, already moving past toward the still smoking chaos of the barnyard. "Sheriff's going to want him breathing when he gets here." "Barely, if you ask me. But breathing." Wyatt held him. And for the first time since Rance had ridden into Salt Fork 4 days back, Wyatt Voss looked like an fallen on something entirely, completely his own. Sheriff Loomis arrived at a gallop 10 minutes later, 2 deputies from Prairie Crossing riding hard behind him, and it became clear fast that his arrival wasn't accidental timing at all, because Loomis had spent that day and the one before it quiet, careful, the way a lawman works when he isn't sure yet who in his own county he can trust, riding out himself to lean on the bank clerk in Prairie Crossing, until the man finally admitted whose hand had inflated the cane note. He'd gathered hurried, nervous statements from as many of Wyatt's 11 listed families as he could reach before sundown the night before, and he'd sat up half the previous night with Declan Prescott, going over every detail the foreman was finally willing to say out loud. 2 days. That was all it had taken, once Loomis decided the next fight was finally worth the risk. Garrison Voss. Loomis's voice carried across the smoking, soot-streaked yard, and for the first time since Rance had met him, there was nothing hesitant in it at all. "You're under arrest. Fraud first, harboring a wanted fugitive second, and once I finish going through everything your own son copied out of that ledger of yours, I expect we'll be adding considerably more to the list before this is finished." Garrison stood apart from all of it, watching his barn burn down to its bones, watching his son stand covered in soot and dirt, having just helped capture the very end Garrison had been sheltering for 2 months, watching the whole county's trust in him go up in the same smoke as the bunting he'd hung for a wedding that was never, not for one single honest moment, about love. He didn't fight the deputies when they came for him. "I built all of this," he said quiet, mostly to himself, as they led him past the wreckage of his own barn. "Every fence post, every acre. You built it on 11 other families' fear, Pa." Wyatt said, standing near enough to hear, "That's not building. That's just taking slow enough that nobody noticed until it was too late to stop you." Garrison didn't answer that, didn't look back at his son either, not once, as the deputies walked him toward the waiting wagon. Because there wasn't anything left to fight for. Not anymore. Not with the ledger burning true in front of 60 witnesses, not with his own son's back turned against him, not with the stranger's 4 words from 4 days back finally fully come home to roost. Amos lived. The shoulder wound would leave him with a stiffness in that arm for however many years God still saw fit to grant him, and a story he'd tell at his own fireside for the rest of them, about the day his daughter's courage burned down half a barn and set her free of a debt that had never rightly existed in the first place. The county clerk voided the wedding license within the week, once enough neighbors had put their own names to statements about exactly what they'd seen and heard in that barn. Garrison Voss stood trial 2 months later in Prairie Crossing, and it was Wyatt himself, 26 years old, and finally standing on ground entirely his own, who testified longest and plainest against him. 11 other families sent representatives to testify too, one after another, until the county judge remarked, near the end of the second day, that he'd rarely seen a single ledger do so much damage to so many people at once. The trial itself ran 3 full days, longer than Prairie Crossing's little courthouse had seen in years, and townsfolk came from 3 counties over just to fill the gallery benches, drawn by the particular hunger small places have for watching a powerful man finally answer for himself in public. Martha Hollis testified on the second day, steady and unflinching, her $900 note laid out beside the bank's original $400 for the whole courtroom to compare with their own eyes. 2 more of the 11 families followed her, and by the time the county judge called a recess for supper that evening, the numbers had stopped feeling like abstractions and started feeling like exactly what they were: a slow, patient theft, carried out in careful ink against people too frightened or too proud to ask the county to check. Odessa herself took the stand on the final morning and spoke plainly. the way she spoke about everything, laying out the water survey and the certified copy and the particular timeline of exactly when Garrison Voss had learned the truth and chosen, deliberately, to bury it instead. The prosecuting attorney told her afterward, in the hallway outside the courtroom, that he'd rarely seen a witness make a jury's job so simple, and Odessa had thanked him and thought, privately, that 5 years of keeping honest books had finally proven good for something beyond her own family's survival. Garrison never once looked at his son during the whole 3 days. Wyatt noticed it and told Odessa later that the noticing had hurt less than he'd expected it to, which surprised him more than the verdict itself did. The judge's sentence, when it came, ran to restitution first, every dollar of inflated debt forgiven and reversed across all 12 families, the water rights returned in full and proper filing, and imprisonment second, a term long enough that Garrison Voss would be an old man, if he lived to see the far end of it, before he ever stood on that rise of ground and looked out at his own horizon again. Amos wept, quiet and unashamed, when the water rights verdict was read aloud, and Odessa held his good hand through the whole of it, and neither one of them found any words worth saying that the tears didn't already say better. They rode home together that evening, father and daughter, the oldest mare between them carrying considerably less weight than she had 4 days before, back when Amos had wrapped a lifetime of shame inside a fragile oilcloth packet and pressed it against her own chest like something that might catch fire. I keep thinking, Amos said, somewhere along the quiet road, about what your mother would have made of all this. The trial, the 11 families standing up together. I think she'd have been proud. I think she'd have said it was about time this whole county remembered its own spine. A tired, genuine smile crossed his face, the kind Odessa hadn't seen from him in longer than she could easily count. I think she'd have said the same thing about you, if she'd lived to see the woman you've turned into these past 4 days. Odessa didn't answer that right away. Just rode on a while in the gathering dusk, letting the words settle somewhere deep enough to keep, and found, when she finally did answer, that her voice came out steadier than she expected it to. I hope so, Papa, she said. I surely hope so. Nobody in Salt Fork much blamed Wyatt for what came after. He signed the ranch over to a court-appointed trustee, kept nothing for himself but his own horse and the clothes on his back, and came by the Kane place the morning before he rode south, hat in his hands the same way his father had once carried his, though nothing else about him seemed to belong to that particular inheritance anymore. Didn't want to leave without saying it proper, Wyatt said, standing at the bottom of the porch steps like a man who wasn't entirely sure he'd earned the right to climb them. You could come up, Odessa said. Porch doesn't bite. Figured I'd said enough uninvited things on this land already. A faint, tired smile. Wanted to thank you for not hating me more than I deserved. Back when I still had a hand in dragging you down that street. You let go the second I asked you to, Wyatt. That counted for something even that first afternoon, though I don't imagine either of us could see it clearly at the time. Doesn't undo the asking needing to happen in the first place. No, she agreed. It doesn't. But it's not nothing either. Choosing right the moment you finally understood what right looked like. Plenty of men never get that far at all. Wyatt turned his hat over once more, looking out past her toward the north fence line, toward a horizon that no longer belonged to anybody named Voss. Where do you suppose a man starts over after something like this? Somewhere nobody's already decided who he is before he opens his mouth, I'd imagine. Odessa considered him a moment, something gentler than pity but softer than mere politeness in her face. You'll find it. You've got more decency in you than 6 years of your father's teaching managed to stamp out, and that's worth carrying wherever you land next. That almost sounds kind, coming from you. Don't let it go to your head. He laughed, quiet and real, and it was the first time Odessa had heard him laugh without some old nervous crack running through the middle of it. Take care of yourself, Odessa Kane. And take care of that stubborn cowboy of yours whenever he finally works up the nerve to come back and admit he means to stay. I intend to. On both counts. He swung up onto his own horse then, the only thing his father's ledger had never managed to claim from him, and rode south down the same road that had once carried a stranger north into all of their lives. And Odessa watched him go until the dust of him folded back into the flat gold country, same as everything eventually did in Salt Fork. Sooner or later, one way or another. He wrote to Odessa once, some months later, a short letter that said mostly that he hoped she was well, and that he'd found work honest enough to sleep easy after, and that he didn't regret a single thing about the barn. burning down around the lie his father had built. Odessa kept the letter in the same drawer where she kept her mother's old recipe cards, and answered it kindly, and didn't write again after that, and neither did he, and that felt like exactly the right way for the two of them to finish. Rance stayed long enough to see Amos walking again, slow and favoring the bad shoulder, leaning on a cane he grumbled about daily and secretly, everyone suspected, had grown rather fond of. Long enough to watch Odessa Kane take over her father's books entirely, and the deed to the water rights along with them, filed proper and permanent in her own name this time, with the whole county clerk's office as witness. Nobody in that county dared pat her numbers again. Not while she was the one keeping them. Ruth Pemberton, of all people, became one of her steadiest allies in the months that followed, the kind of friendship built out of an honest apology and the particular loyalty of someone who's watched a person prove themselves right when it mattered. Between the two of them and a handful of the other 11 families who'd found their own courage, once Garrison Voss's had finally run dry, Salt Fork started slowly to look like a town that had learned something true about itself. He left at first light on a Tuesday. The Roan Mare rested, freshly shod, saddlebags packed light, the way they'd been packed the day he rode in. Cutter Boyle rode ahead of him, hands bound for a federal marshal 2 counties over who'd been waiting a long while for exactly this delivery. Odessa walked out to the fence line to watch him go. The same fence where a night of gunfire had once cracked the morning quiet wide open. The same fence where she'd carried him a tin cup of coffee and told him, without quite meaning to, more truth than she'd told another living soul in years. "You could stay," she said. Not pleading, just honest, the way she said everything now. "I could." Rance checked the cinch on his saddle, unhurried, though his hands had gone a shade more careful than the task required. "There's still a marshal waiting on this delivery, though, and a fee attached to it I've been chasing 3 counties for. Feels like the kind of thing a man ought to finish properly, once he's finally close enough to. And after. He considered that a long moment, looking not at her but out toward the flat gold country stretching north. "After's a word I haven't let myself use much these past 3 years. Didn't seem to have much use for it. Do you now?" Something in his face shifted, quiet, careful, the way a man's face shifts when he's admitting something to himself for the first time, and hasn't quite decided yet how he feels about the admitting. "I might," he said. "Salt Fork's not the worst place a man could find his way back to once his business is finished elsewhere." That almost sounded like a promise, Mr. Colby. Wasn't a promise. He swung up onto the mare and looked down at her. Something warm and unguarded finally sitting plain on his face where she could see it. Was a fact, same as before. Neither of them made any promise about roads crossing again, not the kind spoken plain out loud at least. Because both of them had learned, these past 4 days, that some promises are worth considerably more left unspoken than they'd ever be worth broken later. Out on some road, neither one of them could yet see the shape of. "Touch her again," Odessa said. Quiet, not quite smiling, testing the words out in her own voice for the first time since a stranger had spoken them in the middle of a street that felt, now, like it belonged to somebody else's lifetime entirely. "Wasn't a threat," Rance said, settling into the saddle. "Was a fact." "I know." She looked up at him, steady, the way she'd learned to look at everything now. "I intend to keep making it one, whether you're riding through this county or not." Something in his face softened, just at the edges, the closest thing to a real smile she'd seen, cross it in 4 days. Of fire and gunsmoke and hard truths finally spoken out loud. "Figured you might," he said. He rode north with the sun still low and gold across the flat country, Boyle's horse tethered behind his own, and Odessa stood at that fence a long while. After the dust of him had settled back into the road, holding on to the particular ache of a thing that had saved her, without staying around to be thanked properly for it. A ledger had burned to ash that Sunday, and taken a lifetime of false debt with it. A father was alive who might easily not have been. A young man had found, in the wreckage of everything his own father built, the first entirely honest thing he'd ever done with his own 2 hands. And a young woman 19 years old, keeper of every column and every figure that had ever mattered to her family's survival, had learned, at 11 and again at 19, that the only hand worth trusting with her own future had been her own hand all along. Not her father's signature, not a stranger's rescue, however welcome her own. 4 words carried a long way that spring, further than the man who first spoke them ever meant them to travel. Salt Fork never did forget the sound of that street going quiet, or the sound of that barn finally fully burning every last one of Garrison Voss's lies down to the ground. And somewhere, Right now, in some other town nobody's written down yet, somebody else is standing too still, the way this whole town once did, waiting on somebody to say it first.